Here's what's coming up on The World Today. Group of 7 G7 leaders hold annual meeting in Hiroshima, Japan. Iran executes 3 men in connection in anti-government protests last year. A UN refugee agency spokesperson said that more than 1 million people have been displaced by fighting in Sudan so far, including 250,000 refugees. UN refugee agency spokesperson Matthew Saltmarsh said the latest figure includes some 843,000 people displaced internally and around 250,000 people who have fled across Sudan's borders. Saltmarsh added Egypt has so far received the highest number of Sudanese refugees, with around 110,000 arriving there since the conflict broke out last month.
Month since the fighting have started, we're making an urgent appeal for the safety of civilians and to allow humanitarian aid to move into Sudan as we continue to scale up our response for the over 1 million people who have now been recorded as displaced within Sudan or to neighboring countries. Within Sudan, people are braving danger, notably moving from Khartoum, Darfur, and other unsafe areas. In total, over 843,000 people have been internally displaced within the country, according to the IOM, with neighboring governments and UNHCR having recorded almost 250,000 crossing borders to date. The numbers of those fleeing to Egypt, which is the largest host, are rapidly increasing. And with partners, we estimate that the numbers currently are around 5,000 every day arrivals. That makes a total of almost 110,000 Sudanese who have entered the country, according to the government. Many of those who have approached us are in a distressed state, having been exposed to violence or traumatic conditions in Sudan and having suffered arduous journeys. Many have also lost or been separated from their family and in need of urgent medical treatment. You mentioned the agreement in Jeddah. Of course, I think that commitment was extremely important, and I'm sure all our other partners in the United Nations would agree that the commitment to allow civilians to flee the fighting and to allow aid, much urgently needed aid, to come into the country is absolutely essential. Unfortunately, what we've seen in the last couple of days is continued horrendous fighting on the ground, shelling, bombing. And it's extremely important that what was committed to in Jeddah is actually enacted on the ground so that much needed aid can come in.
Meanwhile, for the UN Children's Agency, 368,000 children have been forced from their homes in Sudan, and a further 82,000 have fled into neighboring states. It estimates 190 children were killed in the first 10 days of the war and 1,700 injured. In Port Sudan on the Red Sea, where thousands of people have fled in the hopes of evacuation, a group of artists have volunteered to organize recreational activities for children to alleviate the pressures on their mental health.
Children, of course, in Sudan are bearing the heaviest brunt of the hostilities. Before the conflict, children were already caught in a perfect storm of crisis on top of crisis. And what this conflict has done is that it has further aggravated the already ongoing health and nutrition crisis, the water scarcity crisis, and it's deepened the learning crisis. I mean, before the conflict, we already had 7 million children between 6 and 18 years of age, of school-going age, out of school. We already had 611,000 kids under 5 suffering from severe acute malnutrition, with 3 million kids under 5 suffering overall from malnutrition. We are, with this crisis, with this conflict, we have seen a nationwide closure of schools and educational institutions. Already we were talking about 7 million kids out of school, 12 million somehow in schools, but very disruptive learning over the last couple of years, particularly in the last year and a half, due to teachers' strikes and school closures across the country. You can imagine what the impact now is with the school closures on the mental health, psychosocial well-being of children. Children are under enormous distress, as you can imagine, particularly in the hotspot locations of this conflict due to continuous bombardment and shooting. And we have seen this and experienced this firsthand.
And there are many difficult stories coming from Sudan, one of which is a refugee, Halime Adam Musa, who's fleeing Sudan for Chad with her family for a second time. 68-year-old Musa is one of 60,000 Sudanese refugees, mostly women and children, who have poured over the border since the war broke out in their country, April 15, seeking safety in Chad, one of the world's hungriest, most neglected countries. For her, it is a repeat journey. In 2003, she had fled her village of Tedelti in Sudan's western region of Darfur when it came under attack by government-backed Janjaweed militia, ethnic Arabs, who were then targeting farmers and herders. As a mother of 7, she spent 6 years in a refugee camp in Chad with her children before being allocated a small plot of land to farm, which allowed her to get by for a decade. Now, the fighting in Sudan between the military and paramilitary force has forced her to flee again, now living in a makeshift refugee camp that is rapidly spreading into the desert around the sleepy Chadian border town of Kofrun, reeling from the latest loss of her home and livelihood from farming. To talk some more about the situation there, African Affairs analyst Ibrahim Anoba joins me now for more. Hi, Ibrahim. This conflict has dragged on for more than 4 weeks now. What's your assessment of this whole bad blood between the warring parties?
Well, thanks for having me, Millicent. So this is becoming much more clearer as we go into the second month of this conflict. And what is becoming much clearer is that this is really not about the argument from both the RSF and the army that the civilian component of the transitional government was to blame, that we just needed to get rid of the prime minister and let the army run things. So it's not that anymore. We now can say that it's clearly a selfish war between two generals who simply want power for themselves. And we can also say that at this point, conversations about ceasefire or ending hostilities for good needs to include more than the US or Saudi Arabia or even the army. It now needs to include the Sudanese diaspora, the civil society, African Union in much more like a concerted conversation, because these talks in Jeddah have been going on for how many weeks now, and we can't really pinpoint to one concrete consequence that has reduced hostilities in Sudan. So maybe it's time for us to include more parties in this negotiation and deploy different tactics to ending this conflict.
Last week, we saw the SAF and the RSF make a sort of humanitarian pledge without a truce. I mean, do you think that commitment to respect humanitarian principles is also playing out to an extent that they are willing and hoping that they will come to some sort of agreement very soon in any way?
So unfortunately, I do not think so, because you look at the conversation in Jeddah, these two parties are not even talking to one another directly. They are using third parties to have conversations. So, I mean, how can you expect a conflict to end when the two hostility parties are not, having direct conversation? And we can also see that the humanitarian situation in Sudan is becoming dire, and not only as about 1 million people, according to UN records, about 1 million people are now they become internally displaced. And you look at countries like Chad and countries like Ethiopia, which already have their own internal political, economic, humanitarian crisis because of conflicts in those different countries. And you look at the amount of people pouring out of Sudan, going into these already dire countries, and you cannot prevent yourself from thinking about a much more problematic humanitarian condition for the entire region. So, for example, I was watching one report this morning where businesses as far as Maiduguri in northern Nigeria are now being affected by the situation in Sudan. Normally, those businesses import their hides and skin and groundnut from Sudan through Chad, but because of the conflict, they cannot get their supplies. So you're looking at an economic and humanitarian situation worsening across the region because of this conflict.
And Ibrahim, just yesterday, the Kenyan president said that they should stop their nonsense. And if you notice, since the fighting broke out, we've seen airstrikes, sounds of anti-aircraft missiles. Residents have even reported to have witnessed fighter jets. One wonders, how do they have much access to such capability weapons? Or do you think that, there are other players, perhaps even other countries involved in this war?
You know what, Millicent, that is a fantastic question. Because, we know Sudan doesn't manufacture Kalashnikov, it doesn't manufacture surface-to-air missiles. So how is it getting these weapons? Of course, there has been incredible report that the Wagner Group in Russia, the Russia-affiliated Wagner Group, the paramilitary group, is pretty much involved here. They are in deep relationship with the RSF, the faction controlled by Dagalo, and they are, in fact, smuggling guns and weapons into Sudan in exchange for gold, which Russia has been reported to be using to fund its war in Ukraine. So you can see a kind of armed trade going on between the RSF and the Wagner Group. But as far as the army is concerned, the army also, according to reports, has a relationship with Egypt. And you also remember before this conflict started, the Russian state, not Wagner Group at this point, the Russian state had good economic relationship with Sudan in terms of arms trade. So the army already had a good stockpile of weapons before the conflict started, and the RSF is getting more weapons from Russia, from the Wagner Group. So you can see that there are third-party interests involved here. And this is why I said earlier in my response that maybe it's time for us to look at this supply. When you call the supply chain, then, there cannot be many weapons coming into the country except from places like Chad or Libya, where, there are mercenary groups that can easily, bring weapons into Sudan. But if you primarily cut the state and non-state actors importing weapons into this conflict, then maybe that could, take us into the parts of, having hostility being seized forcefully.
So, Ibrahim, if you had a crystal ball, how long do you see this conflict continuing, or do you see perhaps a peaceful settlement in sight?
So, as an African, I really want this to end as soon as possible. You have to look at the facts. These two parties are not yielding. They're not talking to each other directly. There is a continuous influx of weapons into this conflict. Humanitarian aid cannot get to the people. Even US and the UN do not have strong leverage over these two generals. If they are strong leverage, the US and the UN will probably be using them right now, but we cannot say what the leverage are. So if you do not have a way of bringing these two warring factions to the table and have direct conversations, then you cannot predict this hostility to end anytime soon. More so because there are third-party interests. As I said, Sudan is strategically located on the Red Sea, and China, Russia, even the US, they want to have relationship with whatever government comes out of this. And all these superpowers have to strategically relate with these two warring factions, because the RSF could win this war. It could win this war. The army could also win this war. So whichever side wins the war, China, Russia, US, and other bigger power across the world will have to construct their relationship with that party. So it's more so of an interest game going on here. And it's so unfortunate that the Sudanese people, women and children, are the front line bearing the brunt.
Perhaps an African solution to the problem also is in sight. We'd like to thank you, African Affairs Analyst Ibrahim Manoba. Thanks for joining us this time.
Thanks, Melissa.
We're now in the United States, where Montana residents are reacting to the new TikTok ban. TikTok users and experts weighed in with views ranging from agreement to concern and skepticism. TikTok, which is owned by China's ByteDance, has faced growing calls from U.S. lawmakers, state officials to ban the app nationwide over concerns about potential Chinese government influence over the platform.
So what this bill does is it bans TikTok from operating in Montana and fines TikTok and the app stores anytime someone accesses TikTok or anytime someone is able to download TikTok. And so this has the effect of preventing people in Montana, over 200,000 users in Montana, from accessing the app. The fine is pretty large for TikTok and app stores. It's $10,000 for each time someone accesses the app or downloads the app, plus an additional $10,000 every day. So the fines can really add up. So this legislation would not fine individuals or bring any criminal penalties against individuals who access the app. It is designed to penalize TikTok and the app stores. However, people are concerned. They're concerned about losing their access to this app, especially small business owners. I've heard from people in Montana that use TikTok to access customers across the country. It's a really small state. The customer base is small. They need TikTok to, build a business. Throughout our history, the government has always used national security concerns to justify violations of our free speech rights. It's the oldest trick in the book to try to justify taking away the speech of Americans, and that's why it's something that we need to fight. We can't just accept the idea that something is bad for national security and therefore it justifies limiting our speech.
It's just not really enforceable. So one of the main issues is that the internet was not designed with jurisdictional boundaries in mind. The law is trying to force Apple and Google through their app stores, and TikTok itself, it's trying to force them to deny access to TikTok based on whether they are located in the state of Montana. And so the challenge for these companies is that when your mobile device contacts their servers, they don't know where you are. All they see is something called an IP address. An IP address says where you are on the internet, but it doesn't say anything about where you are geographically.
Well, joining me for more on this is our Washington correspondent, Maria Bird. Hi, Maria. It's good to see you. I mean, we're hearing this story coming out from Montana about the ban of TikTok. First, how are, people reacting to this?
Well, this ban on TikTok has definitely been something that has been expected for quite some time now. Many Americans have been watching to see how the federal and the local governments have been discussing their concerns around China and around data privacy. Montana is the first state to say that they are going to move forward on this ban. It will not take effect until 2024, as you all reported earlier. But it's clear that this is one step toward a political issue that I think has been looming for some time. But Americans are concerned that this is way beyond politics. This is about the First Amendment right, the freedom of speech.
So some people say perhaps this is a move to exercise powers over national security.
Yes, this is, national security, I think, is one of the concerns. There's been a lot of talks here in the U.S. over the past week about artificial intelligence. I think there's a major concern around data breaching, what potentially data can be used for, and cyber attacks. And so they're using TikTok potentially as where they feel we could be seeing additional data and cybersecurity attacks. So the U.S. has very limited regulations and boundaries on the internet and on uses of technology such as TikTok or any other social media device. But we also know it's a huge piece of the American economic base, especially for up-and-coming small business owners.
And Maria, also, with this has happened in Montana, do you think other states would perhaps follow suit, with this action?
We could potentially see a few outliers that follow in with Montana. I think overall, I think that, as you shared earlier, the ACLU has been very vocal against this. And so you'll have various lawsuits that'll be brought forth for states that decide to move in this manner, like Montana. And so I don't think you're going to see a widespread very quickly, but you will see a few that will follow in line with Montana.
And, Maria, for those who use TikTok, I mean, I, for one, I just can't imagine, not doing that. So I wonder, for those who are unhappy with this, what other options they have, especially if you're living in Montana.
Well, I think the hope is that before 2024, this law will be reversed. I think it's hopeful that when it's brought to the court system, the courts will reverse the law and will force Montana to allow TikTok to be used. So at this time, I think the real push is going to be to try to reverse the law.
Well, Maria, let's switch things a bit. The U.S. president is attending the G7 summit. We know there are lots of talks about his visit to the Japanese city Hiroshima, even as the country is grappling with the debt ceiling crisis. What more can you tell us? I know, of course, Ukraine is on the front burner with sanctions on Russia, but what else to benefit the United States will be discussed amongst the G7 economies?
Well, the G Summit, as you said, Hiroshima has been a big piece of this trip, and obviously very much a political stance for the U.S. And has been a long part of the history of the United States. But as you said, the debt ceiling has been the topic of discussion here in the U.S. And right before President Biden left, he was just finishing talks on that debt ceiling. So I think it will be the economic issues the U.S. is facing, the global economic issues, how the world can work together on some of these issues. And obviously, one of the big issues that has become an economic and an environmental issue is climate change. So I think you'll see some of those key factors coming forth. And obviously, President Biden trying to receive support from the global community as the U.S. Is approaching this debt ceiling issue and potentially the default on some of the loans, and ensuring that the rest of the world still sees the U.S. as a viable economic country.
Maria, thanks a lot, and do enjoy your weekend. And we're in Africa, where Zimbabwe has released about a fifth of all prisoners under a presidential amnesty order meant to decongest the country's overcrowded jails. The Zimbabwe Prisons and Correctional Service said more than 4,000 inmates, mostly men, were let out in what is described as a noble gesture. Violent criminals, as well as those convicted of robbery, treason and public order offences, were excluded. Prisons in Zimbabwe are suffering from extreme overcrowding. The move comes ahead of the general elections in August. Authorities in Iran have executed 3 men sentenced to death in connection with the nationwide anti-government protests last year. The 3 were convicted over their alleged involvement in a shooting attack that killed 3 security personnel in Afghan in November. Amnesty International says they were subjected to unfair trials and allegedly tortured. 4 other protesters have been hanged since December. Dozens more have reportedly been sentenced to death or charged with capital offences. And tens of thousands of South Korean nurses went on strike today after President Yoon Suk-yeol vetoed a law to improve their pay and working conditions. The bill passed the opposition-led parliament last month, prompting protests from some doctors and nursing assistants who said the new law would open the door for nurses to provide treatment without a medical license. Nurses say that the doctor's claim is groundless and that the country needs more care centres to cope with its rapidly aging population. In vetoing the bill, Yoon said that the new law caused excessive conflict among medical workers and that nursing practices outside medical institutions would cause public anxiety over the healthcare system. And the wreck of the ill-fated Titanic ocean liner has been visualized in full for the first time as part of what researchers say is the largest underwater scanning project in history. The full-size 3D model was created with data gathered by 2 submersibles named Romeo and Juliet during a 6-week expedition to the North Atlantic wreck site in the summer of 2022. In all, the mission gathered 16 TB of data from the wreck, 3,800 meters below the surface. Scientists involved in the project described it as a game changer, which offers to completely rewrite our understanding of the 1912 disaster. Titanic sank in the early hours of April 15 of that year, killing 1,517 people. Researchers say the study was conducted without interfering with the wreck, and the team held a flower-laying ceremony in memory of the dead. Queen Camilla attended her first solo engagement as monarch yesterday since her coronation. Queen Camilla visited a primary school in southwest England where she took part in a drawing class with pupils. King Charles and Queen Camilla were crowned at London's Westminster Abbey on May the 6th in Britain's biggest ceremonial event in 70 years. In London, Princess of Wales Kate met with children at the Anna Food, a charity dedicated to providing mental health services to minors.
And that rectangle that we draw, we're going to draw a big circle, like that, right in the middle. Like that. So it's two diagonal lines.
Meanwhile, Britain's Prince Harry and his American wife Meghan celebrated their fifth wedding, or are still celebrating their fifth wedding anniversary today. Meghan, a former US actress, and Harry, son of King Charles III, became one of the world's biggest celebrity couples since their glittering marriage at Windsor Castle. In January 2020, the couple announced they would step away from their position as senior royals, citing forced and invasive coverage as a major factor in their decision. The announcement sent shockwaves throughout the royal family as it tried to reposition the couple's position in public life. And finally on the program, thousands gathered in the Chinese city of Xi'an to enjoy a musical gala performance by singers from Central Asia and China. The gala, which marked the Year of Culture and Art of the Peoples of Central Asia and China and the opening of the China Central Asia Youth Arts Festival, was staged in Xi'an's Tang Paradise, a complex based on an imperial Tang dynasty garden, and a performance that underlined how different cultures perceive beauty in their own way and can exchange and absorb different concepts of beauty from other cultures in a harmonious way. Performers sang songs from the 6 countries before joining on stage to sing together. Chinese President Xi Jinping, Kazakhstan's President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, Kyrgyzstan's President Sadir Japarov, Tajikistan's President Emomali Rahmon, Turkmenistan's President Zadar Badimuhamedov, and President Shavkat Mirziyoyev of Uzbekistan were all in the northwest China city to attend the China Central Asia Summit. Quite beautiful sounds coming from central China. Well, that's our program this evening. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Walker. Bye for now.